There is something about the hallways of a high school that stays with you long after you've left them behind. Long after the lockers have rusted shut and the teachers have retired and the faces of your classmates have blurred into something half remembered, half imagined. Those hallways carry a particular kind of energy, the nervous electricity of young people figuring out who they are, making mistakes, forming bonds, and sometimes, without even realizing it, finding themselves at the center of something much darker than they ever expected. High school is supposed to be about textbooks and cafeteria food and bad haircuts. It's supposed to be about first crushes and Friday nights and worrying whether you said something embarrassing in front of someone you liked. And for most people, that's exactly what it is. But for a handful of people, the kind of people who send their stories into channels like this one, who find that even years later they still need to tell someone what happened to them, high school was something else entirely. For some of them, those corridors were the setting for something they could never quite shake. Something they still think about when the house is quiet late at night and sleep won't come. Something that started small and ordinary and slowly, almost imperceptibly, became something that made them question everything they thought they knew about the people around them. Because that is the nature of what we are talking about tonight. That slow, creeping, unsettling feeling that someone is watching you. That prickling at the back of your neck when you walk to your car. That moment when you look up across a crowded room and realize that someone's eyes have been fixed on you for just a little too long. Stalking, in all its forms, is one of the most psychologically disturbing things a person can experience. And when it happens during those already tumultuous high school years, when you are young and still figuring out how the world works and who you can trust, it leaves a mark that doesn't fade easily. Tonight, we have 5 extraordinary stories. 5 real accounts from real people who found themselves being watched, followed, fixated upon, and who came out the other side with experiences that range from deeply unsettling to genuinely life-changing. Some of these stories will make you feel afraid. Some will break your heart a little. And at least one of them, I promise you, will leave you absolutely stunned. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. And if you're joining us here for the very first time, welcome. Make yourself at home, hit that subscribe button, and come be part of our community. You are going to want to be here for every single one of these stories. Our first story tonight comes from a young woman who describes herself, with a warmth that comes right through the page, as someone who genuinely loved growing up the way she did. She was what people sometimes call an army brat, a kid who moved around constantly because of a parent's military career. And while that kind of upbringing breaks some kids, leaves them feeling rootless and disconnected, she tells us it did the exact opposite for her. She loved it. Every new posting, every new school, every new town was a fresh start, a new adventure. She would drop into a place, spend a year or so getting to know people, make a handful of friends she could keep in touch with long after she had moved on, and then she would pack up and go somewhere new and exciting. It was, she says with complete sincerity, a childhood she would not have traded for anything in the world. She was built for it. Adaptable, social, curious about people. The kind of girl who could walk into a new school in the middle of junior year and have a lunch table full of people within a week. And so, when she arrived at yet another new high school, she is careful not to name it, or the state, or give any identifying details, even though the events she is about to describe took place back around 2016, which is a fair few years ago now. She settled in quickly, just as she always did. She made friends. She found her rhythm. She found her corner of the library, which was, she admits with cheerful candor, where she spent a considerable amount of her free time. She was the kind of teenager who was passionate about writing, deeply interested in English and storytelling, and harbored serious ambitions of becoming a journalist or perhaps even a novelist someday. She already had a finished novel under her belt at the time she tells this story, unpublishable, she admits freely, and very much a work in progress, but still. She was doing something. She was putting words on paper. She was committed. And she was also, with that same cheerful candor, writing a great deal of fan fiction in that library. Entirely smutty fan fiction about celebrities, which she is absolutely not going to go into the details of, except to tell us it existed. It was absurd, and it is in absolutely no way relevant to what happened next. The point is simply this: when you are deeply engrossed in writing something you find hilarious and slightly embarrassing and completely entertaining, you do not always pay close attention to who is around you. You look up occasionally. You sip your water. You look back down. The library hums. Other students come and go. And you do not necessarily notice exactly when someone new has started spending their afternoons at a table a few rows away from yours. She did not notice, at first, when Andrew began showing up. Now, let me tell you about Andrew, because Andrew is important. Andrew was a fellow student at this school, a young man who was, by any measure, remarkable. He was somewhere on the autism spectrum, and while this made certain kinds of communication genuinely difficult for him, it did not in any way diminish his intelligence. He was extraordinarily gifted in mathematics. He had a natural, almost encyclopedic grasp of science. Academically, he was exceptional. But his social skills were, by his own baseline, severely limited. He could not easily communicate with his peers in the conventional way. He was also hard of hearing, which added another layer of difficulty. His speaking voice had a quality to it that sometimes led unkind people to make assumptions about him that were not warranted. And yet, there were ASL students at the school who knew the truth about Andrew. When he could bring himself to engage, when the conditions were right and he felt safe enough to open up, he was capable of having the most profound, intellectually rich conversations you could imagine, all conducted through sign language, which he had mastered. He was, in short, a remarkable and deeply complex young man who simply existed on the margins of the social world around him. And Andrew, for reasons she could not initially explain, had started watching her. She noticed it gradually. The way he would appear at a table a few rows away in the library, holding a middle-grade book that he was clearly not reading. The way his eyes would track her rather than the pages. And then she started noticing it elsewhere. In the corridor. Near the cafeteria. In places she didn't expect to look up and find him. He was always just there. Always watching. Quietly, without aggression, without any overt intention she could pin down. But watching. Now, she was careful about who she mentioned this to. Because Andrew, she quickly discovered, was one of those people that an entire school wraps its arms around without ever quite discussing it. He had this quality that made people want to look out for him. And if you had told the wrong person that you thought Andrew was following you, you might have found yourself on the wrong side of public opinion very quickly. She trusted a small handful of friends, brought it up carefully, and at first, they brushed it off. Andrew wasn't like that, they said. He was a gentle giant, and she wants to make clear here that the word giant was not used loosely. Andrew was very nearly 7 feet tall. She is not joking about that. But then she pointed him out to her friends. She showed them the way he watched her. And they could not deny it. Something was happening. The first afternoon that Andrew followed her home, she knew she had to take some kind of action. But what action? She didn't want to blow this up into something that could hurt him, could turn people against a harmless young man who had never done anything threatening. All he was doing was watching. It wasn't a sinister kind of watching, she kept telling herself. It wasn't the kind that made her feel like she was being looked at as an object. It was more like fascination. As though she were something he was trying to understand. And so she made a decision that might seem strange, but was actually quite clever. She decided to observe the observer. She watched Andrew watching her, and she kept careful notes. One of her friends helped, too. And together, they arrived at a conclusion that confused them completely. Andrew wasn't truly stalking her in the predatory sense of the word. He wasn't following her for dark reasons. He was staying close to her. There was a difference, subtle but real. He wasn't pursuing her. He was positioning himself near her. As though he was keeping an eye on her from a safe distance. As though he was making sure she was okay. She felt slightly better about this, and simultaneously even more confused. What possible reason could Andrew have for doing this? What did he know, or sense, or feel, that she didn't? And then things started to get genuinely frightening. At night, she began noticing movement in the yard outside her house. Her parents both worked demanding military jobs and often came home late. Her younger brother was 12 years old, a sweet kid who was, as she puts it with sisterly affection, far more skilled at video games than at serving as any kind of protection. The motion sensor light on the outside of their home kept triggering, over and over, at odd hours. Something, or someone, was out there in the dark. Then she discovered the scratches on her car. Marks that looked like someone had been trying to force the lock. And then came the note in her locker. She chooses not to repeat what the note said, and honestly, given the way she describes it, we do not need her to. What she does tell us is that it described something deeply disturbing, what someone wanted to do to her. She describes the content as something out of a horror film, and the tone of it, she says, was not the clumsy, desperate tone of someone with a crush. It was calculating, controlled, chilling. And it was written in the most immaculate, flowing cursive handwriting she had ever seen. Beautiful, careful, almost ornate penmanship. And this detail confused her more than almost anything else. Because she had seen Andrew's handwriting. She had seen his essays. His handwriting was barely legible, the kind of scrawl you might expect from a much younger child. There was simply no way that Andrew had written that note. So was someone else involved? Had he somehow enlisted help? The whole thing seemed impossible. And meanwhile, Andrew just kept watching. And then one day, he wasn't there. She heard through the school grapevine that Andrew had a medical appointment at a neurological clinic and would be away for several days. And she felt, she admits, a small and guilty wave of relief. She should have known better. That very evening, she opened her locker and found another note. Worse than the first. And this one had blood smeared on it. If you've ever experienced anything that made your blood run cold, write in the comments and tell us. Because I think many of you will understand exactly the kind of fear she felt holding that note in her hands. That night was a Friday. She was alone in the house overnight. And whoever had been lurking in her yard came back. A figure dressed entirely in black, clearly not Andrew, the height and build were completely different, was in her yard pulling up plants and inexplicably spraying the garden hose around. She called the police. She even shouted out the window that she had called them. And the figure didn't leave. He stood his ground for nearly an hour, leaving only when the distant sound of sirens finally cut through the night. She was now caught in something that made no sense. There was clearly someone fixating on her, leaving threatening notes, lurking outside her home. But Andrew was also watching her. Were they connected? Were they working together? The whole thing seemed utterly improbable. And then it all came to a head on an ordinary sunny afternoon. It was warm enough to skip the school bus and walk home. A nice day, the kind that makes you feel safe. She was about halfway home when she became aware that Andrew was behind her, ducking behind walls and hedges, tracking her movements the way he had been doing for weeks. And something in her finally snapped. She had had enough. She was going to turn around and confront him, right here, right now, and demand to know what on earth was going on. She turned. And Andrew charged. Nearly 7 feet of him, barreling toward her across the distance between them at full speed, and she was absolutely frozen on the spot. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only stare as this enormous young man came hurtling toward her, and then at the last second, veered sharply to the right and threw himself into an overgrown hedge bordering the park they were passing. There was a scream. Not hers. His. And then there was chaos. Andrew came flying back out of that hedge with a figure dressed in black clothing locked in his grasp. He slammed this person to the ground with terrifying force and began shaking him, physically bouncing the man's head against the grass, shouting something over and over that was almost impossible to make out in the noise and confusion. She ran forward without thinking, with no idea whose side she was supposed to be on in that moment, only knowing that she had to see what was happening. And then the black-clad figure's hood fell away. They made eye contact. And this man, this stranger, immediately began unleashing a torrent of vile, hateful slurs directed at her. He seemed genuinely convinced that she had hired or manipulated Andrew into acting as her bodyguard. He was furious about it. And she still had no idea who he was, until one of her friends came running up behind her and shouted 2 words. The janitor. The school janitor. A man she had barely noticed, had never thought twice about, had passed in the halls dozens of times without a second glance. And now here he was, pinned to the ground by Andrew, having been lurking outside her bedroom window at night, leaving blood-stained notes in her locker. Destroying her garden, trying to break into her car. The answer, when it finally came, was extraordinary. Her father's role in the military was military police. The janitor had been a private soldier approximately 15 years earlier. Her father had been the one to catch him in the act of assaulting a female officer, and had made sure the man faced consequences. Military prison. Dishonorable discharge. A ruined career. When her family moved to this town, the janitor had spotted her father. Had recognized him. Had done research. Had discovered that this man he despised had children. Had discovered that his daughter attended the high school where he worked. And had decided to take his revenge on the most vulnerable target available to him. She does not know, she says quietly, what kind of voice Andrew heard that told him something was wrong. She does not know whether she believes in those kinds of things. What she knows is that Andrew, somehow, in his own unique way of seeing and experiencing the world, had picked up on something that not a single other person in that school had detected. He had noticed the janitor's attention. He had felt something dark in it. And he had made a decision, without telling anyone, without asking for credit, without even being able to explain it properly when asked, to keep this girl safe. Even when the janitor threatened him personally, promised to hurt him if he didn't stop. Even that didn't stop Andrew. She did her best to befriend him after everything came to light. It wasn't the kind of friendship that fit into a neat box. Andrew wasn't built for conventional friendship, and she understood that. But she thinks he knew, in his own way, how grateful she was. How much it meant to her. Her father arranged a transfer not long after, and she left the school. But she still keeps in touch with Andrew to this day, through email, mostly, and occasional online chess games, which he wins every single time without mercy. He is, she says, the person who saved her life from a man who might very well have taken it. And for that, she is genuinely happy to lose every chess game he ever wants to play. Our second story tonight comes from a man who is now approaching the end of a long and dedicated teaching career, 25 years in world history classrooms, a buzz cut, a cardigan, a soft middle that his wife finds endearing. He describes his current appearance with the cheerful self-awareness of a man who is genuinely comfortable in his own skin. But he wants us to understand that it wasn't always that way. When he started teaching in his mid-20s, he was, by his own honest account, conventionally very attractive. His wife, looking at old photographs, compares him to a certain actor who is widely regarded as extremely handsome these days, and he does not dispute this. He was young and good-looking and acutely aware of both facts, and in those early years before he settled into the life and the marriage he now treasures, he was not exactly living a monk's existence. He had a social life. He dated co-workers. He enjoyed himself. He is honest about all of this without apology, because he wants us to understand the full picture of who he was at the time, specifically so we understand the contrast with who he became the moment he stepped into a classroom. Because that was the thing. The moment he entered a classroom, any classroom, on any day, he became a completely different person. His mentor had made it very clear from his very first week of teaching, you can be approachable, but you cannot be their friend. You can inspire them, but you cannot take them under your wing. And he had taken that lesson to heart completely and without reservation. He had seen what happened to teachers who blurred those lines. He had watched a colleague's career collapse under a cloud of suspicion and whispered accusations. He had absolutely no interest in ever finding himself anywhere near that kind of situation. He understood, with crystal clarity, the responsibility he carried the moment those students walked through his door. And he honored that responsibility. So when he tells us about Billy, not her real name, he wants us to hold all of that context in our minds. Because what happened with Billy was, despite everything he had done to prevent exactly this kind of situation, a genuine nightmare. Billy was a senior. She had recently turned 18. She had, by any objective measure, everything going for her. Head cheerleader. On track for prom queen. A strong academic record. A boyfriend. A future. There was no reason, on the surface, for her to be fixating on her world history teacher. And yet. He knew immediately, he says. Good teachers develop a kind of radar for these things. A student with a harmless crush gives off signals that are easy to read and easy to manage, a lingering glance here, an overeager after-class question there. And a firm but kind redirection takes care of it. But Billy was different. Billy was not impulsive. Billy had a plan. It began with questions about her assignments. Reasonable sounding, thoughtful questions, brought to him in those few minutes after class when the room had almost emptied. At first, he took it at face value. She was a smart girl, smart girls asked questions. But the pattern became too consistent. She was waiting for the room to clear before she came to him. She was engineering those brief windows of near privacy, and she was doing it deliberately. He recognized it. He set boundaries. He spoke to other members of the staff quietly, and discovered he was not alone. A few others had their own minor incidents involving Billy. Nothing egregious, but enough to confirm that something was there. And so he put a structure in place. His classroom door would remain open at all times. His colleague Chris, the English teacher, would happen to drop by after Billy's world history class on a regular basis. Convenient, reliable, present. Billy, gradually realizing that these conditions were not going to change, stopped trying to engineer those private moments. He thought they had navigated it. He was wrong. A new member of the administrative staff, unfamiliar with the history, told him one day that there was a student outside the teacher's lounge asking for him. He walked out with his coffee and found Billy standing there. And what struck him immediately, beyond the surprise of seeing her, was her outfit, something that very clearly did not comply with the school's dress code. He didn't want to engage with her about the clothing. He kept it simple. What did she need? Billy told him she was struggling with her coursework, a claim her very healthy grades flatly contradicted, and asked if she could arrange some private tutoring sessions with him. He said no. He said it quickly, perhaps a little too quickly, and felt the small uncomfortable pinch of guilt that follows too sharp a refusal. He softened it. He explained that private sessions weren't something he could offer to one student without offering them to everyone, which wasn't feasible. He offered her instead the contact information for a retired tutor, his own former world history teacher, a lovely woman in her 70s who occasionally took on tutoring work. He wrote down the number and pressed it into Billy's hand. Billy never called that number. Instead, the notes started appearing. Typed notes, he discovered, on one of those old word processor machines, the kind that had been fashionable in the 80s, the technological step between typewriters and computers. The kind of machine that a wealthy family might very well still own. He could not prove the connection, of course. But the content of the notes made the author's identity obvious enough. Love letters, at first. Earnest and slightly unnerving expressions of feeling. He ignored them entirely but filed every single one with the principal. The staff was largely in agreement by this point. Billy was behind the notes. But they had no hard evidence, and they were acutely aware of the sensitivity of the situation. Billy's father was a respected figure in the community, a man in construction who had done genuine good, building affordable housing, supporting the school. A decent family by all accounts. Generous and well regarded. And nobody wanted to blow this up unnecessarily, especially not without proof. They wanted to find a way through it that didn't destroy Billy's reputation, didn't humiliate her parents, didn't set fire to everything around a girl who was clearly struggling with something. That good intention became harder to sustain when the love letters began to shift in tone. The warmth curdled. The longing became something colder and more disturbing. The notes began to contain threats. Not vague, not ambiguous, detailed and deeply troubling descriptions of harm. He and the principal were getting very close to involving the police. And then he found the item in his desk drawer. His classroom was always locked. He was meticulous about that. No student was ever alone in that room. And yet somehow, someone had gotten in. Inside the drawer was an item of women's underwear, crotchless, and bearing a small embroidered initial that corresponded to the first letter of Billy's real name. She had left it there deliberately. She was not trying to hide her involvement anymore. If anything, he suspected she almost wanted him to know for certain that it was her, because she was confident, on some level, that he would not go to the police. She knew he didn't want to hurt her. He handed the item, in an envelope, to his principal. He describes this as one of the most acutely embarrassing moments of his entire adult life. The principal, a sharp and no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s, examined the evidence with a professionalism he found both admirable and deeply uncomfortable. She told him that this could not be allowed to escalate further. She told him she was genuinely worried for him. And she made him promise that regardless of how guilty he might feel about the situation, if it came to it, the law would have to be involved. Her concern was real. His discomfort was real. But prom was coming. And graduation. And then Billy would be gone, and he would never have to see her again. He allowed himself to hope that the underwear left in his drawer was her final dramatic gesture. Her curtain call. He was wrong about that, too. Prom night. He was a chaperone, as many of the staff were. Billy was the almost certain prom queen, everything pointed to it. She had the votes, the boyfriend, the crown all but waiting for her. Her boyfriend Brad was a perfectly nice young man who gave a sweetly earnest speech from the stage about how much he loved her and how she would always be his queen. Then Billy took the microphone. She turned to Brad and knocked the crown clean off his head. And what followed was a scene of such complete public devastation that it left the entire room in stunned silence. She dismantled Brad in front of everyone, dismissed him as a boy pretending to be a man, accused him of things that should never be said over a microphone at a high school dance, said things that she clearly could not take back and probably would not have wanted to. And then she turned to face her history teacher. She told the room, in front of everyone, that he was the one she was meant to be with. That he was a real man. That they were soulmates. That they were destined. Someone at the lighting board, he has some very uncharitable feelings about this person, even now, put a spotlight on him. The silence that followed was enormous. He had no choice. There was nothing to do but speak. He told her, as kindly as he knew how, that there was no chance. That she was young and he was an adult and that was the end of it. That she would find someone right for her, but that person was not and could never be him. That she was, to him, simply a student. A child. He kept his eyes down as he spoke. He was ashamed, embarrassed, desperate to get through it. He didn't look at her. He didn't see her face. He heard the slow clapping start. Then the laughter, a wave of it, rushing through the entire room, all directed at Billy. The most humiliating night of her life. He didn't have time to feel guilty. He saw her move. She leaped down from the stage. She grabbed the long, sharp cake knife resting near one of the prom desserts. And she charged at him, dress flying, mascara-streaked face twisted with a pain he had not fully understood until that moment. He used the defensive martial arts training he'd kept up for years to sidestep her and send her sprawling, not to the ground, but into a table behind him. A table holding an untouched sponge cake. The knife flew from her hand. Billy crashed through the table, and the table gave way, and she went down in a spectacular collapse of cake and punch and scattered food. The silence was total. And then the laughter came back, louder than before. Billy pulled herself to her feet. Dress ruined. Food everywhere. She looked at him, and he braced himself. And then she said, just 2 words, softly, almost to herself, I'm sorry. She turned around and walked out of the gym. The rest is quieter. Billy, clearly, had needed psychiatric support for some time and had hidden that need from everyone around her. She graduated. But college wasn't possible yet. The 2 years that followed were spent in a rehabilitation facility. Her parents did not blame him. They thanked him, sincerely, repeatedly, for the way he had handled the entire situation. They kept him informed of her progress as time went on. He moved to a different school eventually, in a different state. The letters from her family followed. And then one day, they wrote to ask whether he would be willing to receive a letter from Billy herself. They would completely understand, they said, if his answer was no. He said yes. It was a single sheet of paper. A single short paragraph. He still has it. He says he could type it word for word from memory, because he has read it many times. It said, "Thank you for not taking advantage of me. I'm sorry I pushed you so far. I'm better now. I'm going to college in the fall and I'm going to study world history, and I will make you proud." He does not know where Billy is today. He hopes she has found her best life. He hopes whatever was driving that pain has been healed. What he knows is this: as he approaches the end of 25 years of teaching, Billy gave him lessons he never expected to learn. And he still will not be alone in a classroom with anyone who isn't a colleague. Not ever. If this kind of story resonates with you, if you've ever found yourself in a situation where the people around you turned out to be something completely different from what you expected, share this video with a friend tonight. Because the next story is one that starts with trench coats and teenage rebellion and ends in a place none of us could have predicted. Our third story comes from someone who goes by Frankie. And Frankie wants you to understand, right from the beginning, who he was in high school. He was a skater kid. A grunge kid. A proud, unashamed fan of bands that most of his friends had never heard of: Real Big Fish, Green Day, Sublime, a bit of Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and then some deeper cuts that he wore as a kind of musical badge of honor. He was a self-described musical snob wrapped inside the body of a scruffy teenager who could mostly just fall off a skateboard gracefully and make it look intentional. He was, along with his twin sister Kimmy, part of the skater crew. The losers. The punks. And they loved every second of it. And their heroes, their absolute idols, were the trench coat goths in the year above them. At the head of this group was a fellow who called himself Alex Crowley. Alex claimed descent from one of the most infamous and controversial occultists of the 20th century, a claim that was essentially impossible to verify but also essentially impossible to disprove, and Alex wielded both of those facts with great theatrical confidence. Frankie is pretty sure neither of Alex's parents were secret descendants of anyone notable, and he also has some opinions about the character of the person being claimed as an ancestor, but he keeps those thoughts relatively brief. With Alex came 3 others: Ashley, Jack, and Felicity, Flick. Jack, Frankie tells us, was a thug, and he had his suspicions about Jack's relationship with animals that he doesn't want to dwell on. Ashley was there but largely peripheral. The 2 people who matter for this story are Alex and Flick, it should be noted, was not like the others. She was actually kind. She was warm. And Frankie, a teenage boy in a ridiculous trench coat and squeaking leather pants, was absolutely and hopelessly in love with her. The 2 groups, the skaters and the Sons of Joseph, as Alex had named his little crew, circled each other for a while with that specific teenage tension that exists between groups who are more similar than they want to admit. And then one weekend at the skate park, something shifted. Flick walked over, not to Frankie, to his eternal disappointment, but to Kimmy, to tell her that she was impressive on a skateboard. Kimmy, being a good sister, mentioned it to Frankie. And Frankie, being a lovesick 16-year-old, immediately asked if he could come along when Kimmy went to the mall with Flick the next day. He could. And he did. Jack got thrown out of the mall within the first hour for getting into a confrontation with a security guard, which Alex dismissed with theatrical disdain as the behavior of a liability. And then Alex turned to Frankie and Kimmy and asked whether they might like to take Jack's place in the Sons of Joseph. Frankie looked at Flick. Flick's mascara-rimmed eyes were bright and warm and looking right at him. He nodded immediately, like a puppy who had just been offered a treat. Kimmy, more sensibly, asked what the Sons of Joseph actually meant. Alex tapped the side of his nose and said that was something they would come to understand in time. And then he informed them that they would need entirely new wardrobes. Kimmy had their father's credit card. And so it was that Frankie found himself dressed in a trench coat, a band t-shirt, and a pair of leather pants that squeaked audibly with every step. Alex promised the squeaking would wear off eventually, while Kimmy was styled by Flick into something that made her brother deeply uncomfortable. He managed to talk her out of the most revealing option, and she settled on a velour dress that made her look, he admits, like quite a convincing vampire. What followed over the next several months was a slow-motion unraveling of Alex's mystique. The more time Frankie spent with him, the clearer it became that Alex was, at his core, a complete fraud. He talked constantly, in great sweeping dramatic paragraphs, about his bloodline and his magical heritage and the secret truths of occult practice, and Frankie, being academically curious, actually went away and read enough to confirm that none of what Alex said bore any resemblance to actual documented history or practice. It was entirely invented. Alex was a charlatan playing a role he had constructed for himself, and playing it with enormous conviction. Meanwhile, Alex was pursuing Kimmy with a persistence that made Frankie's skin crawl. Kimmy was more than capable of holding her own, and she had absolutely no interest in anything Alex was suggesting, the implications of which became progressively more disturbing as Alex began claiming that voices from his dark father were sending him instructions about her. When she flat out refused his advances, he suggested that she simply dance for him, naked, with ritual symbols drawn on her skin, and that would be sufficient. Kimmy stopped showing up after that. Too exhausting, she said. And she begged Frankie to leave too. But Frankie couldn't. He was in love with Flick. And by now, Flick was in love with him. They were together, quietly, secretly, because Alex had declared that no member of the Sons of Joseph was permitted to form attachments to anyone except him. The moment they tried to step away, Alex would appear, seemingly out of nowhere. At Frankie's house, once, which was completely unacceptable because Kimmy was there. And then Alex acquired, through a new member of their dwindling group, a baffling freshman named Norbert who was part of the AV club, what he believed was the means to film the female changing rooms at the school. He described this as a mission from his dark father. He had a specific list of filming times prepared. Frankie stole a copy of that list. And what he found on it made his blood run cold. Every time on that list corresponded precisely with when Kimmy would be using the gym or coming out of the pool. Alex wasn't just pursuing Kimmy socially. He was planning to film her secretly without her knowledge or consent. Frankie and Flick took Norbert aside and informed him, in terms that were unmistakably serious, that if he participated in this plan in any way, his time at that school was effectively over. They may have implied consequences that went beyond social ruin. Norbert, apparently, took this very seriously indeed. He changed schools within the month. When Alex realized his plan had collapsed, he turned on Frankie with genuine fury. He slammed him against the wall of the AV room and informed him that since the school plan was no longer viable, Frankie would have to film Kimmy himself. At home. Where it would be easy. And his dark father would reward him beyond imagination. Frankie told him exactly where he could put that offer. And finally, it was over. Alex was out of their lives. Frankie and Flick could be open about their relationship. Kimmy no longer had to manage the exhausting, creeping threat of Alex's attention. They breathed. They celebrated. They played three-player GoldenEye deathmatch in Kimmy's bedroom and thought they were free. And then Kimmy noticed a strange red light flickering across the screen. She laughed at first, assumed someone was messing with a laser pointer. But the light vanished, and then came the sound of scuffling outside. Frankie went to the window just in time to see a trench-coated figure disappearing into the dark. Alex had been there. Testing the angle. Seeing if he could film through Kimmy's bedroom window. They waited. They knew he would come back. Flick had the inspired and somewhat ridiculous idea of printing out a large, extremely unflattering image and taping it to the inside of the window. Kimmy announced loudly, for the benefit of anyone listening outside, that she was going to take a shower. They waited 10 minutes. And then, when they heard movement outside, they pulled the blind open. They heard a strangled yelp. Something clattering to the ground. Running footsteps fading into the distance. They went outside to find the school's camcorder abandoned in a flower bed. They watched the tape. It turned out Alex had filmed considerably more of Kimmy than any of them had realized. Kimmy took the tape from their hands and watched the rest of it alone. When she came back, her face was pale. "Just underwear," she said. "But I feel sick." She didn't say anything else. Nobody asked. A few days later, Alex was found with both legs broken, apparently the result of a baseball bat. He claimed to have been attacked by strangers. Nobody in their group asked Kimmy whether she had anything to do with it. Frankie, telling this story years later, does not say directly what he believes happened. He doesn't have to. What he does say, in the last line of this story, is the most quietly devastating thing in the entire account. He addresses his sister directly. He says that even though she passed away 6 years ago, he will always be proud of her. Like this video if these stories are getting to you, because this next one takes a completely different turn. It is funny, and bittersweet, and it ends with a revelation that none of us saw coming. Our fourth story comes from a woman who grew up in the mid-2000s and spent most of her high school years in a tight-knit girl group, and one single gay male friend called Guy, who was, she says with enormous fondness, the campiest, most flamboyantly gay person you could ever hope to meet. Their friend group had a pact. No dating during high school. No serious romantic entanglements. They were going to focus on their studies, on each other, on their futures. And for the most part, they kept it. Until senior year. When hormones apparently became too powerful for even the most principled of pacts. But until that point, they had been impressively disciplined. Which is precisely why they nearly fell off their chairs when their friend Samantha, the most straight-laced, most carefully put-together girl in their entire circle, accidentally let slip that she had a sugar daddy. What followed was an interrogation of legendary proportions. They wanted to know everything. The gifts, yes, she had them, shoes and jewelry and clothes. Was it physical? Yes, very much so. Was she sorry about the pact? She was, but this man might be the one, and she was not willing to let go of that possibility. They pushed further. How old was he? Mid-40s. Was he married? Yes. With children? Yes. Did they know him? Samantha said no. But her hesitation, and the look in her eyes, said something very different. They pretended to drop it. They smiled, said they were happy for her, and then, individually, separately, without coordinating, they all started watching Samantha. It sounds terrible, she acknowledges. She stands by it anyway. Their 16-year-old friend was being, in their view, taken advantage of by a married man twice her age who was almost certainly not telling her the truth about his intentions. They were not about to stand by and do nothing. The name that kept circling back was Mr. Kurzweil. The science teacher. Balding, bespectacled, biology. Samantha met with him after class with suspicious frequency. He took phone calls in hidden corners during lunch. He would slam his laptop shut if students were nearby when class started, then wait until he was sure no one was watching before opening it again. There was something off about him. They could all feel it. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. One Saturday when Samantha had made a point of not being available, claiming she had a hot date with her mystery man, they all piled into Guy's car and followed her. For nearly an hour they drove, ending up in a neighboring town that nobody would choose to visit without a specific reason. A town with a strange smell, a slightly run-down mall, and no particular charm. Not exactly the setting for a romantic rendezvous with a wealthy older man. Samantha headed into the mall. They followed at a careful distance, split up strategically, and sent the most inconspicuous among them. She describes herself as comfortably nondescript, which she accepts without complaint, to follow Samantha alone. What she witnessed was not what any of them had expected. The gifts from Samantha's sugar daddy had not been purchased. They had been stolen. She watched Samantha move through 4 different stores with practiced, invisible efficiency: costume jewelry, lingerie, a cropped top, various accessories, and not a single security guard noticed a thing. She extricated herself quickly, not wanting to be anywhere near the situation, and met the others at their agreed meeting point. She was ready to drop her revelation. But her friends got there first. They had, while waiting, spotted Mr. Kurzweil. Here. In this mall. Over an hour from their own town, at a location that was objectively worse than their local shopping center in every possible way. What reason could he have for being here? She let them finish their excited chatter. And then she told them what she had seen. The room, so to speak, went quiet. There was no sugar daddy. There never had been. Samantha was a shoplifter, a skilled one, who had been stealing gifts for herself and constructing an elaborate fiction about a wealthy older admirer. She had been traveling out of town because local security was starting to take notice. The whole story had been a fabrication. But then, why was Kurzweil here? They couldn't leave without answering that question. They stopped at the food court. And that's where they found him. Mr. Kurzweil was sitting at a corner table, at a quiet 2-seater, holding hands across the table with someone who was not his wife. A man. Not Samantha. A man whose face, when he turned to look at the students staring at him, wore an expression of simple confusion. Mr. Kurzweil's face wore something else entirely. He looked like a man watching years of carefully constructed privacy beginning to collapse. He stood up immediately and asked them to come over. And he told them everything. His wife knew. She had always known. She herself was of similar inclinations, and she had wanted children, which were genuinely his, and they both loved those children fiercely. They loved each other, too, not in the conventional romantic sense, but in a deep, real, enduring way. They had built a life together that worked for them, in their own complicated fashion. But this arrangement had taken shape in a time when the truth would have meant something much harder and more painful than it meant today. They had made a decision together, years ago, and they had lived with it. He said they could call his wife if they wanted to verify any of it. He told them he knew they were good kids. And he looked at Guy as he said it, with a quiet recognition that made Guy go very still. They kept his secret. They provided whatever cover they could. They helped where they were able. And they quietly distanced themselves from Samantha after trying, sincerely but unsuccessfully, to talk her out of the shoplifting. She wasn't interested in stopping, and she had no concern for the well-being of anyone else in the story. They let her go. People, this narrator concludes, are almost never exactly who you think they are. A funny footnote: Guy, the campiest man she had ever met, eventually realized that he was every bit as interested in women as he was in men. He is now, she reports, one of the biggest and most cheerful players she knows. Mr. Kurzweil still lives with his wife. Their children are in college now. And they are, finally, quietly considering what it might mean to live fully as themselves. Our fifth and final story is one that has stayed with me since I first read it, and I think it will stay with you too. It is told by a woman who was part of a small, passionate, slightly chaotic group of alternative theater kids, and who had the misfortune to be part of something that started as an exciting creative adventure and ended as one of the most tragic accidents any of them could have imagined. It was her idea to put on a horror play. She and her friends had badgered their drama teacher for ages, begging to be allowed to do something genuinely original instead of another safe, familiar production. Eventually, their teacher relented. A friend named Kirsten wrote the script, a proper slasher, packed with stage blood and practical effects and at least one genuinely shocking scene involving very convincing prosthetics. Nobody was getting expelled. They were just going to give the audience what they wanted: fear, excitement, and something they would talk about for the rest of the year. They rehearsed endlessly. They knew every line, every cue, every lighting effect by heart. But they had never performed it at night, and a horror play, they agreed, absolutely had to have its debut under the cover of darkness. They convinced their teacher to allow one final rehearsal starting at 8 in the evening. The school's janitor, a gruff and slightly intimidating man called Mr. Williams, agreed to stay late to supervise. She names the people who matter for this story. Herself, Aya, the director. Victor the actor. Judd, who played the killer. Clyde, the tragic hero, and, in the real world, her actual boyfriend. They ran through the opening scene. The mood was electric. They were good, and they knew it. After the first scene, 2 of the actors stepped outside for a cigarette break and did not return. It was inconvenient but not alarming. They occupied themselves tweaking effects and sound cues while they waited. Eventually another actor, Isla, went to look for the missing 2. She did not return either. But they heard her scream. Judd and Clyde ran out into the corridor to investigate. They came back pale and shaking. They had found no sign of their 3 missing friends, only a considerable amount of blood. Some in the corridor. Some on the ground outside. And the only other person unaccounted for in the entire building was Mr. Williams. In the particular mental atmosphere of a group of teenagers who had spent weeks immersed in horror, who had spent evenings rehearsing murder and gore and chase sequences, the conclusion they reached felt completely inevitable. The janitor, about whom 100 terrible rumors circulated at any given time, had done something to their friends. 3 of the remaining group, Denny, Vicky, and Judd, volunteered to go for help. This left Aya with Clyde, which suited her fine. They hid in the sound booth and listened in growing horror as sounds filtered through to them, running footsteps, distant shouting, what sounded unmistakably like cries for help. One by one, it seemed, every single one of their remaining friends had met something terrible out there in the corridors of this building. They had no choice. They had to get out. Clyde found a heavy metal bar. They moved through the corridors quietly, quickly, watching for movement. The blood they had seen before was gone. Williams had cleaned it up, they assumed. There were no bodies. The building was silent. And then the door to the maintenance area burst open. Mr. Williams stood in the doorway. He had something in his hand. His face was furious. Clyde did not stop to think. He charged. He struck the janitor across the skull with the metal pipe, sending the man to the ground, and then, in a state of absolute terror-driven certainty that he was defending his girlfriend's life, he continued. He struck the man's legs with enough force to ensure he could not get up, could not follow them, could not come after anyone. He narrated his reasoning out loud between the blows. He did not want to kill him. He wanted to make sure they were safe. By the time he stopped, Mr. Williams could not walk. And then the door opened, and every single one of their supposedly murdered friends walked in and shouted, "Surprise!" The word died on their lips immediately. They stared at Clyde standing over the janitor's broken body, the pipe dripping, his face unrecognizable. And they understood in that moment what their stupid, idiotic, thoughtless prank had done. Clyde faced legal charges. Given the circumstances, the terror, the genuine belief that he was protecting his girlfriend, he spent only a couple of years in juvenile detention. But his life was changed permanently. The others were expelled, every one of them. More than one took a very dark road afterward. At least one, she tells us quietly, has since ended their own life. And she herself has never fully recovered. She has been in and out of psychiatric care. She still cannot fully convince herself, on a deep irrational level, that there was not something genuinely dangerous happening that night. She knows there wasn't. She knows. And yet. She says she does not know if telling this story will help. She does not know if she deserves to feel better. But she knows what she wants to say to Mr. Williams, to his memory, wherever it rests now. She is sorry. He was not the threat. He did not deserve any of it. And now, if you have made it this far tonight, I want to hear from you. Which of these stories stayed with you the most? Which one made you catch your breath? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if something in these stories reminded you of your own experience, share it with us. This community is built on exactly that kind of connection. Don't forget to like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who loves stories like these, and make sure you have that notification bell switched on so you never miss what we bring you next. Because there are always more stories. There are always more people out there with something extraordinary to tell. And we will be right here, every time, to listen.